Good evening, everyone. TMYS welcomes you to the stories of floods and displacement under TMYS Review September 2021. We are calling for submission stories, essays, and poems as a part of the project. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Erin Spelly among us to talk about the role of cinema and the Department of Film Studies in raising environmental consciousness and victim sensitivity. Professor Erin is a filmmaker and writer whose poetic nonfiction films have been screened at the New York Film Festival, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Rotterdam International Film Festival, Edinburgh International Film Festival, Whitechapel Gallery in London, and more. She is the co-director of NEST, abbreviated for Nature, Environment, Science and Technology Studio for the Arts, and an assistant professor for cinema studies and the moving image arts and critical media practices at the University of Colorado Boulder. I am Megha Majumdar, pursuing my post-graduation in English literature from St. Xavier's College, Calcutta, and I'm privileged hereby to carry out my interaction with Professor Erin tonight. We welcome you, Professor, and now I request Professor Erin to move forward with her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here today. I just want to offer first my hopes and good wishes for health to everyone in these really difficult times of the ongoing pandemic. And it's a privilege to be here to be speaking with you today. I'll be drawing on some conversations I've had with various colleagues of mine at the University of Colorado Boulder, collaborators on a recent Mellon Sawyer seminar grant, which has allowed us to really problematize and think through the role that the arts might play in considering our shared environmental futures. So I want to especially thank my colleagues, Dr. Lori Peak, who's the director of the Natural Hazards Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and art historian, Dr. Brianne Cohen. All right, so let's go ahead and start my presentation here today. And share screen. Wonderful. So I want to be thinking specifically about floods, but larger the idea of catastrophe and the role that cinema might play in how we think about and respond to victims of catastrophes, notably floods. So we can go to the next slide here. And again, I just wanted to recognize my colleague. If we move ahead here, I will do that. Let's see. I wanted to recognize my colleague at the Natural Hazards Center, Dr. Lori Peak, who says that a natural disaster occurs somewhere around the world on average once a day. So the frequency and intensity of these events is skyrocketing as climate change and disasters of varying sorts, from COVID to droughts to floods, become primary symptoms of an unhealthy planet. And the arts, notably cinema, have a really powerful role to play in fostering empathy and attuning our sensitivity to humanity's shifting challenges. Ecological destruction, as we know, often affects those who can least resist its impacts and those who are least responsible for it. Communities are the ones to absorb the shock of catastrophe, from mudslides to hurricanes, wildfires to deforestation, species extinction, and endocrine disruption. And this happens in unequal ways. Therefore, to generalize about losses, precedents, and paths forward becomes detrimental to understanding the uneven particulars of the Anthropocene. I just want to think about, again, the breadth of the destruction. This is from the Dust Bowl in the U.S. in the 1930s, and this is from the Cuyahoga River in the U.S. in the 1970s. So I want to think today about narrative and nonfiction cinema offering us a vehicle for specificity, for insight, and for clarifying individual impacts of suffering and enhancing a larger collective sensitivity for the victims of catastrophe. I want to propose here 4 modes of thinking about the ways in which cinema offers entry into the lives of those affected. And then also offer these 4 examples of films that work within these various modes, although not exclusively. So one way in which cinema operates is that it allows us to look in, it sheds light on an unknown experience and into a community or onto a particular event. Cinema can also create mental empathy. It can also elicit embodied empathy. This is a term that was described by Dr. Talma Hendler, a neuroscientist at Tel Aviv University. And this is a visceral reaction and empathetic reaction to seeing something on screen. And then the 4th way I want to offer today to think about the cinematic arts is as an affective mode of understanding a place or people. So these 4 films I've chosen as examples for working through these various forms today. Still Life from 2006, directed by Jie Zhangke. The Johnstown Flood from 1989, directed by Charles Guggenheim. Beasts of the Southern Wild from 2012, directed by Ben Zetlin. And Jan Villa from 2010, directed by Natasha Mendonca. So I want to begin with the Johnstown Flood. This is a documentary, and it's actually, it won the documentary short form Academy Award winner documentary short in 1989. And it tells the true story of May 31st, 1889, the Johnstown Flood, in which 2,000 lives were lost when the South Fork Dam in Pennsylvania collapsed. And this short documentary was based on the first book written by historian David McCullough, who went on to have a quite illustrious writing career. But it's particularly potent because the reason for the disaster was a failure in human technology and actually agreed and overemphasis on the wealthy. It turns out that an old earthen dam had been poorly built and poorly maintained, and it was made for a lake for an exclusive summer resort patronized by wealthy Americans, including Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, and Andrew Mellon. And as I mentioned earlier, the idea that a film could unearth something and shine a light on a particular community that might have been forgotten, that's what happened in the case of this film. It was really a forgotten piece of American history. And the documentary is constructed without much attention to empathy or affect, but really is one of conveyance, instructional, and it does not move specifically into the personal, but it allows people to think, and it's a powerful tool for thinking about the implications of failed infrastructure, of greed, of hubris. So in that sense, it really was critical to bring back the idea of this catastrophe that had quite affected and taken many lives in American history. I want to just mention on another note that the Johnstown Flood was also portrayed in a narrative film starring Janet Gaynor in 1926. And this was an incredibly personal and specific portrait following Janet Gaynor as she prepares for her wedding day and the festivities, all of which are cut short by the flood. So moving to another narrative film that tells the story of a flood and a dam and a man and a woman affected by rising river water, I want to move to Jie Zhangke's film Still Life from 2006. This won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival in 2006, and it was LA Film Critics' pick for Best Foreign Film. It hybridizes documentary and fiction and looks at how lives can be upended by geoengineering, by enforced technological fixes that disregard individual lives. And it centers on a town of Fengji in China and looks at people who have been devastated, bewildered, undone by the Chinese government's construction of the Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest dam. And towns dating back 2 centuries were submerged, forced families to relocate. And in particular, this film follows 2 characters, San Ming, who you see here, a miner, and Shen Hong, a woman, a nurse who's looking for her husband. And through these 2 portraits of people, we see very clearly how disorienting life in a flooded world can be. The director, Jie Zhangke, sets up viewers for a sense of profound mental empathy for these people who are searching and toiling in what feels like immense obscurity. And it's difficult to see beyond the walls of the gorge here, and that's partly because of the way the film is shot. We feel both trapped by the landscape and also trapped by the bureaucracy, and the impenetrability of trying to make a difference in this particular world and worlds. So, as an example of more visceral empathy, I want to move to this film here. Oh, this is another image of the Three Gorges Dam, just to give you a sense of the scope and the scale, the massive, massive dam here. So now I want to move to a film that offers a more visceral and embodied empathy, and think about Beasts of the Southern Wild. This film looks at the rising sea levels along the shores of the American South. Namely, it was inspired by the Ile de Jean Charles, which is off the coast of New Orleans, which is intimately acquainted with flooding, of course, from the 2005 Hurricane Katrina devastation and ongoing devastation since. So the film follows this child protagonist you see here on her constructed boat. Her name is Hush Puppy. And the cinematography of this film, which was done by Ben Richardson, provides a very intimate and close-up portrait of this child. The close-ups are often handheld, and this creates a jarring vision of what it's like to be in the tumultuous world of this child and facing so many unknowns of flooding and in this case also losing parents. The image is punctuated by fireworks. The camera is jostled by chickens moving and squawking, or waves pounding upon the shore, leaks springing. And there's a kind of desperation and futility to the experience of the depiction of this very willful, resourceful, and precocious child facing natural forces relatively alone. So the emotional impact of watching her move through reality and also into a world that is more speculative. There's a little bit of magical realism, and that too provokes a more embodied empathy than most cinematic depictions of floods might do. So let me then also describe this film here, Gianfilla, from 2010, directed by Natasha Mendonca. This is a film that is less readily available, not easily seen, but it is a very personal portrait in a very different way. So let me see if I can describe some of that. This was made after the monsoon floods of 2005 that submerged Mumbai, and the filmmaker returned to her home city to examine the personal impact of that devastating event. Mendonca describes her film as, quote, a tapestry of images that studies the space of a post-colonial metropolis, but in a way that deeply implicates the personal. The destruction wrought by the floods becomes a telling and a dismantling of other devastations and the sanctuaries of family and home. In its structure, Gianfilla is a vortex, drawing to its center all that surrounds us. So this is a very quiet portrait. We see flooded streets, and we see close-ups, as you see here on the left, of plant life, detritus that's floating in the water. But we also see domesticity that carries on, that moves ahead in spite of all of the destruction and devastation. And I think the power of this kind of portraiture is in the personal carriage of the camera, and in the delicacy of the editing. So the scenes are immersed in the natural world, and in the familial world. We see how things have changed drastically, but how others haven't. And so in turn, this is quite affective. And just on a personal note, I haven't seen this film in full since its premiere in 2010, but it stays with me as a kind of a haunting. So there's a ghostly aspect to it, and I think this is quite powerful in portraits of catastrophe, because again, you feel as if you are there, not necessarily as if you are in a personal character, but you are in a place and you feel it. You feel the sensations of being there. So again, the affective nature of this, of what happens when waters rise and lives are forever changed. I want to think about how one sees the world after devastation and destruction, and again return to the idea that this happens in unequal ways. I'm showing here an image from Buster Keaton's The Boat, which is something of a comedy of errors, and also something of privilege. And it really, for me, emphasizes the idea of how quickly some people are able to get out of situations and move forward. And again, thinking about how hard that is for other people's. So I want to emphasize and close today with the idea that really much of today's ongoing environmental destruction operates on a nearly invisible level. This is an image from a film that I made after a flood in the canyon that I live in. There were numerous floods that came through my area in Colorado after the 2010 wildfires that ravaged. There were floods that came in the years following, many of which took houses, and luckily did not take any of my neighbors' lives, but took many of their homes. And I want to think about how invisible that is to so many people who live outside of it. But again, thinking about the areas that are most affected, and the greatest effect takes place over long periods of time. This generates what scholar Rob Nixon calls slow violence, the ways that people are or not able to prepare for and resist the consequences of such events is shaped by historical and economic forces, and the way a community falters in its recovery may play out over generations. Again, I'm coming from a very privileged place where Boulder County in Colorado was able to respond quite readily to these floods, and in years' time has been able to overcome that, but so many communities are not able to do that. And so the way that cinema is grappling with this, artists are trying to think about how to manifest more invisible and durational environmental changes, especially amid an epidemic of desensitization in globally digitized societies. This is something that visual culture theorist Nicholas Mirtsoff describes as a kind of anti-aesthetic or numbing anesthetic, while affect queer theorist Anne Skvetkovich would view it in another light as a kind of public depression. And that's informed by longer histories of violence tied to colonization and power. So affect may be a way to move publics through sensory experiences and emotional intensity through a variety of vehicles of art making. So how art can enable us to break through some of these is a question. And so again, I've presented a few examples here today, and I just will return to my slide here at the beginning, showing us these four different examples of films that work in very different ways, again, in nonfiction form, narrative form, working into speculative fiction, and then into a more essayistic or contemplative cinema, as in the last example I gave of Jean Villa. So I think we really need to do what Franz Kafka suggests, which is to crack open the frozen sea within us. That desensitization that Mirtsoff writes about is something that cinema is, I think, capable of reopening, cracking open, entering into, allowing people to feel. And cinema's role in empathy and our future sensitivity and understanding of humanity's shifting challenges is ever more important as people are turning to their screens for both entertainment, for information, for comfort in some cases. And so what I believe we need to really be thinking about as new filmmakers are learning and training students of cinema, we need to think about all of the alternate possibilities, steering away from really easy narratives of apocalypse or cli-fi, climate fiction, to find nuances in their storytelling, to find different ways of tapping into various modes of empathy, the ones that I mentioned today, and maybe even finding alternatives, again, with affective modes of storytelling. So that comes, I think, through a wide array of viewing and sensitivity and in ethics to what one puts on screen and what one chooses to watch. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to have a little bit of conversation around the subject now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Firstly, this was extremely insightful, and it is not just extremely theoretical. I could relate with whatever you said, despite belonging from different geographical locations and facing different kind of affectations, as you call it. So, I have a couple of questions that are personal. So, my first question is a technical one. So, as a filmmaker, what are the basic differences you have felt while filming a natural calamity or even the very minutest components of nature and putting them behind the lenses? What are your personal experiences in that?
Well, I come back to ethics on that, with thinking about what one should put on screen and how to do that. So my personal practice is one that is very sensitive about putting the human face and human body on screen. I think it's a very delicate operation to consider how someone gives permission and the difference in power structure of who's behind the camera, who makes the decisions of who should be filmed and in what way. So to be honest, the ways in which that I have approached filming, say the flood that I experienced and the aftermath of the wildfire that was catastrophic for my community, is that I really focused on the non-human. That's something that for me has been quite critical in terms of thinking about how one depicts what's happening. And again, that's a personal choice for me, but it comes down to the kind of history of documentary and the ethics around making. But I respond, of course, quite readily to other filmmakers who are able to create portraits of people. And I know this in particular is kind of thinking specifically about victims of natural disasters, specifically floods. And so kind of my advice or, way to move through this is really to think about permissions and think about time sensitivities and who is willing at different stages to be ready to tell their stories and to share them. So again, kind of in the immediate aftermath of some events, I think I have focused in the past on landscape and on the non-human as a way to show kind of whether that be rushing water or in the case of this flood that I was filming, there were snakes that were coming out of the ground and moving in all of these kind of different ways. And I felt like that for me was what I felt captured the rush and the total chaos of what was happening. And the stories that I was hearing that were quite personal about mudslides and people's houses being inundated were so frightening, and I felt sensitive to them that they were things that I didn't feel I could put on screen. And I think one power that cinema has too is this play of narrative and documentary. So one way that cinematographers and filmmakers can wrest that ethical control back and still be able to tell the stories that really need to be told is by narrativizing. And and taking some of that that intensity of the personal off, and relieving some of that pressure and making it a narrative maybe based very much in truth, but still a narrative. So that's, for example, what Jia Zhangke did with Still Life, was he was using actors and non-actors, people who were living through the flooding event and able to, be in their kind of native space, but not feel as if their stories were being stolen from them. So that hybrid of fiction, nonfiction is really a popular form right now. Chloe Zhao, who just won the Academy Award for Nomadland, was working in that same fashion, working with non-actors, actors. That goes back to Italian neorealism in the 1940s, 1950s, and that was a movement that was really born out of necessity and born out of economy, making films because one didn't have enough money to pay an actor or didn't have enough money to buy film stock, things like that. So I'm excited about the potentials of how cinema can play with that. But personally, if you're asking me as a personal filmmaker, my rule is I'm really interested in the non-human, and turning to that for inspiration and finding ways for us to be reflected back into the natural world. Because I think the earth is responding to so much about what's happening right now. And by shining a camera on and a light on the natural world, we can also see ourselves and have a place for reflection. And I think that's what Natasha Mendonca was doing a little bit in her film there.
Yes,
did I answer your question? I started.
Yeah, absolutely. Efficiently. And once you spoke of hybridizing the fiction and the non-fiction, bringing actors, non-actors, on a very different note, it kind of struck me about I think, if I'm not wrong, 56's Bicycle Thieves. That was also Italian movement formed against the economy right after the Second World War was over, and how the actors had to go back to their actual professions because they couldn't continue being actors. And that was like a whole different tragedy for them. Okay, so sorry for deviating.
No,
so, my next question would be, again, a bit personal to you. So you have film documentaries, you have made your own non-fiction movies, like you call them. So, and I have seen, I'm very impressed by some of your works. I've checked it on your website. Amazingly used, like the colors, the sound effects, amazing. So I have a question, like, when you make this kind of movies and you interact with the non-human space, you interact with insects, you interact with water, you interact with fire and light and everything that is natural, but then again, not human. So how do you form this chemistry with this non-human particles? Like I have seen you going on risky adventures and filming snakes, worms, and I'll come to the worm question later. That's a very interesting portion. So how do you interact with them? What is your secret tactic, if I may call it? And my second question is, and while you're filming all these documentaries in your very personal, abstract way, do you think this might question the very conventional way of wildlife filmography, like we see normally?
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And you're taking the time to look at my films. Yes, absolutely. I am trying to really think about why cinema exists the way it does, right? I've gave a few examples here of different kinds of filmmaking. And I guess one of my goals as a filmmaker is to think how much can we change and question the form of cinema and how we interact with the natural world, how we document the natural world, and how in particular we respond to environmental change. So this is one of the unifying threads of my work is my background is actually in the sciences and molecular and cell biology, and I kind of moved into filmmaking as a way of finding alternatives to science, to telling stories about science. And so that is one of the themes of my work too, as you pointed out, is kind of finding different species that are maybe a little more unusual. So whether that's, worms or larvae or insects of various kinds, that's one aspect of my interest, is trying to shine a light on the things that aren't seen as often. But I also think that these are indicators of what's happening in our environment on a larger scale that are overlooked. So when I think about the history of the environmental movement, and I think about some of the radical shifts in the environment, I often think about Rachel Carson and her work and her writing of Silent Spring in 1962, and the way in which she was able to focus on the insects that were being affected by DDT and other chemicals, as well as the birds that were being affected. And she used those species as a way to reflect back on the human population and just how much we were also being affected by those same chemicals. So in that same fashion with my filmmaking, although I might be pointing my camera at a species of bird like the Steller's jay or a chimpanzee in a zoo in North Carolina, really it's about us. It's about how humans and people are in some case causing other species to go extinct, how we're interfacing with the natural world, and that's something that I think we don't think enough about. And so again, to return to your second question about how I'm perhaps trying to reconceive wildlife cinema, is that the history of wildlife cinema has really been rooted in the idea of having a narrator tell us, a human narrator, of course, tell us what to think, what to see. And I'm really trying to reject that as a way of making a film about the natural world. And this is something, that a lot of filmmakers have grappled with, is how do you convey information beyond the image? Is that how do you do you give information with text? Do you give information with voiceover? What kind of language can be created here beyond the visual? And within the visual, what are the different ways of moving through that? So I have been really trying to experiment. I see myself as an experimental filmmaker that is trying different modes of working, and attempting to, in doing that, make people think a little bit more when they do see my films about what the norms are and the standards that might be overlooked, might be not well considered, because that too is the power of cinema. When you're watching a really powerful film, particularly narrative films that do attempt to have a really empathic and visceral quality to them, you start to forget who you are or where you are, and you're swept away. And that can be wonderful. Believe me, I love that kind of immersive experience. However, I also think that cinema has the power to really be a place for reflection, a place for self-reflection and growth. And that doesn't happen as much when you enter a world and then exit it at the end of the 90 minutes. Again, what I'm really interested in is the affective components and the memory creation that starts to happen in certain cinematic experiences. When do you really start to think, oh, actually, I'm reconsidering the way I feel about something. It's not necessarily unconscious, but it's a conscious, recalibration of who one is. So again, that's kind of a long-winded response, but there's a lot to say about that question, both of those questions. Thank you.
I made a mistake asking for the technicalities, because I have seen the way you use sounds. You try to capture the actual sound of the water and not superimpose it with something in the background. That's beautiful, because this is something I was looking at for the first time in my life. And as a student of English literature, these things actually affect me a lot, because I can feel the entire quote-unquote naturalness of what is being portrayed in front of me. So I was extremely overwhelmed with it. So thank you so much for answering that question. And okay, my next question is about a film that you showed on your presentation, Still Life. And right now, as you said, that how it's supposed to be reflective, how a person should like self-reflect on what he or she looks at. So, do you think that both Still Life, like you mentioned, is about a Chinese background suffering from a post-flood trauma? So, do you find any differences in that way? How the Occident and the Orient portray their own traumas, post-flood or post-calamity traumas in their movies? Like I belong from an Orient country myself, so this question actually bothers me because you showed the films, you also took the last one, and I could relate with that to a certain extent because I'm familiar with that city, but I'm not familiar with China. I'm not familiar with America. So, do you feel any differences made in their view of making cinema?
Oh, that's a hard question, but important. I do. I mean, I think everyone comes from a particular place, and geography and history informs how someone tells a story. And so that's why I think it's so important to have different perspectives on storytelling, and so many voices, so many more voices should be brought into cinema. You know, it's interesting that the sciences are so often critiqued for not having a really inclusive perspective, but I actually think cinema is even more cloistered. It's harder to break into as a woman, as a person of color, and Hollywood has had for so long such a monopoly on the way that we've seen the world, and that's changing. So a filmmaker like Jia Zhangke is working inside of China, but also against China in some ways. There have been some controversies in terms of his portrayal of Chinese politics. And that's informed his filmmaking, because he, of course, is slightly critical of the way in which China enforced these mass migrations, enforced the flooding of these towns against thousands of people's wills, and without much care for their individual lives. And so he really, you know, is painting this portrait that, again, is very specific to that place, but I believe it to be universal in a lot of ways too. I mean, for me, the reason I paired that particular film, Still Life, with the Johnstown Flood is that they're so similar in one sense, right? We've got a dam that's been created by people with a lot of money, with a lot of power, and that dam then has killed people, has upended lives, and caused unexpected flooding. In the case of the Three Gorges Dam, there was some expected flooding, but there was also unexpected flooding as well. So I really think, you know, moving across both time and geographic space is what cinema does best, and also, you know, thinking about historical accounts versus more contemporary ones. For me, I don't discriminate in those terms, and in the same way, I don't feel any discrimination geographically either. Like I can respond just as much to thinking about what that life might be like to be living inside the Three Gorges Dam after flooding. So yeah, I guess at some level, I don't want to make a binary between the Occident and the Orient. For me, it's much more nuanced than that, and I don't think there's an easy way to split it. But I do think there is something maybe more along the lines of the mass-produced film or the commercial film versus a more personal portrait film that is that's an auteur film made by one person. So the Natasha Mendonca film, for instance, is one I really wanted to put forward as an artist's film, because that again has a very different sensitivity to place. It means that one person was moving through that space with a camera versus a whole crew. And I think that alone gives a very different sense of people and place. And I think it's, again, really important to have that range depictions of what's happening post-flood, so that there are different ways that people can relate. We have so much variation in terms of how people come to media and how people are willing to watch it, and what moves them. The way too that cinema has shifted in terms of how we're seeing it. So much of the way we're watching cinema right now is on a single screen, by ourselves, maybe, alone. And I hope soon we're going to be back in a different space where we're going to be able to see things on a big screen and all together. But cinema's power is very different in those realms. It's very different to watch a film alone on a small screen versus in a collective setting. So filmmakers are having to respond to that as well. And I think that's something that we need to be responsive to, as we move forward technologically, and societally, is how are people imbibing their cinema and their media and their information, and how therefore can we adjust to some of that and find ways to reach people where they are. So that, I think, also is critical.
Thank you so much, Professor, once again, because I asked something and you actually answered it with a solution, with a remedy of how we can actually dissolve the differences and look at it with a singular perspective. So for my next question, which is kind of technical, and I will demand for more like an opinion than an answer. And for that, I need to check my question. It's kind of scientific. So as you said, with a bachelor's degree in molecular and cell biology, you have very fantastically fed your passion for filmmaking with the concept of looking for basic, minimalistic, and most importantly, smaller, natural resolutions to the issues of the environment. And as I've already mentioned, you're working with the worms in your production, Tenebriomolator, correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, that came out in 2019. You have explained and justified how yellow mealworms have the capacity to digest or break down styrofoam into hydrogen and carbon with the help of their gut microbiome. So based on that, what do you think would be an ideal and natural way to cope with a disaster like flood, which might be called natural, but is ultimately an outcome of man's misusing the environment in many ways?
Oh, that's that's a tricky question as well, because the flood of the Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania really was caused, as you say, because of us, in a very palpable way, because of geoengineering. And so many of the floods that we've experienced have been failed dams or other things. And those are, of course, very immediate causes. And as you say, there are, the effects of climate change are causing all sorts of other disruptions that are a little less tangibly blamable, but clearly also anthropogenic in cause. So I'm wary overall of finding some easy technical fix, thinking, okay, we can solve this by doing X, or science will allow us to do this. But at the same time, I don't think we should eschew technology entirely. I'm not willing to do that, and I am, as you know, very interested in thinking about breakthroughs in the sciences. And so, the film that you mentioned, Tenebriomolator, that was looking at these larvae of darkling beetles that are capable of biodegrading styrofoam, I found a great deal of inspiration in, because I was encouraged to think that one of our large plastics problems right now, of thinking about how to deal with the massive amount of plastics in our oceans, in our waterways, might be ameliorated by something in the natural world, and potentially heightened or improved by some of our own technologies. And there are labs working right now on thinking about how plastic eating bacteria might be amped up a little bit and allow for a faster biodegrading process. So that kind of thing is something I wanted as a filmmaker to point to and bring a little bit more attention to, and think about the ways in which, again, we overlook some of the more microscopic or minute aspects of the natural world. When it comes to flooding, I mean, I'm certainly no expert on that. I do know that one of the major concerns in the aftermath of a flood is water quality, and the pollution that comes with the flooding that is so often, again, I think that the media often sensationalizes the initial event and then maybe follows a community for a few days after. And the images that get shown the most are the ravaged buildings, or the torn out waterways, or the mudslides, or things like that. But what I, as a filmmaker and as a person, really care about, again, is the longevity of that community and the victims of that space over time, because that's really, one, hard to depict in the media. And two, it's one of those things that it's not easily solved. So you kind of can't swoop in and fix it immediately. It's complex and it's nuanced, and it really takes a lot of concerted effort. So I think that's something that cinema is having to grapple with, is how do you show that kind of longer time of recovery, and think about how to respond to that. Of course, the scientific components of this are so massive, it's even difficult to kind of encompass them all. But of course, we need to be starting at ground zero with thinking about, okay, how can we prevent loss of glaciers? How can we prevent global warming and these kind of massive disruptions in our climate? That starts at a kind of extractive, economy level of where is our global capitalism going? How do we tamp that down? How do we change our practices around consumption? That's, again, such a massive kind of thing that's happening there. It's hard to encapsulate, but that's one level. But again, one of the things I think I would point to from the scientist's perspective is looking at water quality, looking at the more minute components of how we help a community immediately after a flood. And water is one of those places where I think the science is at a level where it should be able to swoop in rather quickly and say, okay, let's do testing. Let's make sure we can get people what they need. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm going all over the map because it's such I'm trying to stretch from both filmmaking to science and the micro to the macro. But I hope that gives you a little bit of sense of what I'm thinking here of how, again, cinema has a responsibility to change its practices and not just depict the easy and the sensational aspects of something, but really find ways to make people think in longer terms and with more care.
That's absolutely very enriching in a way, because your profession itself and the way that your academic background are extremely interesting. They are like two poles apart, but then again, you mix them so very well and so efficiently. So my last question for the day would be, like I asked for a solution from your side in a scientific way. So is there a suggestion that you would like to give to the budding film enthusiasts who want to walk on something like this, like you're walking in, and how to make it more natural and like leaving all the flamboyancy apart, how to make it reach to a lot of masses who are geographically apart, but then again can relate with what is being shown?
That's a challenge. And I think, again, one of my takeaways is just to see as much as one can, to view widely across time and across geographies and different modes of filmmaking, to think about what's possible, and not to take anything for granted. Um, there's the adage that you are what you eat, and there's also the same that goes for cinema. You are what you make what you see. Maybe it's the same in English literature, or in literature as well. It's what you read influences what you write. So this is so important then, I think, for budding filmmakers to really think about what they're consuming visually, orally, audibly, and think about why things exist the way they do, and how things might shift or change, and not be afraid to take risks. In terms of reaching broader audiences, that's a challenge. I mean, we're in a very fractured media environment where people are seeing so many things, again, on their screens, and in very short form. I mean, we're seeing this kind of profusion of ultra short form making. And I think that's really exciting, because that has a lot of potential as well. And so I would encourage any budding filmmakers to think about kind of what platforms work for them, and how they can work within those, and that certainly can reach broad audiences quite quickly. But I would also counter that by saying it's not necessarily how many people you reach, it's who you are able to move and shift and create new memories inside of. So I really believe that a lot of the media that we're consuming right now is very fungible, and it disappears very quickly. There's an ephemerality to it. And unfortunately, that means that, 5 days after you see a YouTube video, you forget what it was, or that you saw it, in many cases. So how can a filmmaker create something that has some lasting effect, and that can really change the landscape, the interior landscape of a person who's seen it? What would that look like? How can that happen? And also, I guess I just believe very strongly too that, one of our humanity's greatest challenges right now is the Anthropocene, and coping with all of the changes that are being wrought on the planet. And we need to grapple with that. We need to address that and find ways of emotionally adapting, and being able to move forward, and find some solace in one another. And in my case, I look to the natural world for that kind of solace and for that kind of hope. And so for any particular filmmaker, finding ways of working within that, and not shying away from those challenges. Sometimes that can mean bringing humor in, that can mean bringing metaphor, or maybe horror or science fiction. It doesn't matter. Again, I feel so strongly that we need that diversity of genre. We need the diversity of form and geography and place and people making and number of people working on a particular work. But yeah, I do believe that no matter what, when you make a film, it has to matter. You have to care about it, and that will make it more likely to enter into somebody's memory bank and to be carried forward. So that's my kind of attempt at imparting some thoughts for future filmmakers.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was a lovely session, and I can't really tell you how overwhelmed I am right now. I got to learn so many things, and how your contributions make so much sense in this world today. So thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Megha. It's been a pleasure and an honor to speak with you. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we look forward to receiving more submissions of stories, essays, and poems on displacement and rehabilitation of flood victims under TMYS Review, September 2021. Please stay safe, drink warm water, take good care. Good night, everybody, and a very good morning to you, Professor. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.